So Supercharged Breakers has released in Japan for a little while now, and Surging Sparks is just around the corner for us over in the West. In fact, it's probably already out by the time this video comes out. And I know this is a little bit late, but this is going to be the set list review video. Again, it's late because for the past week or so, I have been sick, and you might be able to still hear it in my voice. I'm still recovering a little bit, but I can actually talk now instead of sounding like I was going to die. Instead of doing this video how I did last time, where I was just scrolling through the list trying to find good cards, I actually took the time to go through the list, and I've picked out all the cards that I'm going to be talking about in this video. But as always, if you see something that I missed, or there's something that maybe you saw that should be worth talking about, let me know in the comments, and let me know in the comments your thoughts about the set in general. Of course, I'm going to be going in set order as always, so we're going to start off with the first Pokemon, that being Durant EX. Now this one isn't necessarily a good card, it's not that strong to be honest, but it's an EX card, so I might as well talk about it. So it's a 190 HP grass Pokemon with an ability and an attack. This ability says that when you place Pokemon from your hand onto your bench, you can discard the top card of your opponent's deck. Kind of weak, not gonna lie, but it could be decent in like a high mill type deck, a deck that wants to discard as many cards as possible. For example, something like Regidrago. There's a couple of times where Regidrago can go to deck out, but that's kind of rare to be honest. And then its attack for 1 grass and 2 colorless does 120 damage, and then 30 more damage for each prize card your opponent has taken. A very heavy cost for an attack that at max can do 5 times 30, so 150, so 270. That is not a lot, but the card is an EX card, so I might as well include it on the list, even though it's probably not going to see any play because it is very, very weak. And now we get into actual good cards. First up is Victini, 70 HP fire type Pokemon with an ability very similar to, I believe it's the Pokemon Go Zapdos, which says attacks used by your evolution fire Pokemon do 10 more damage to your opponent's active Pokemon. Key thing to note here is that it says evolution fire Pokemon, so it doesn't account for basics and stage, well, it does account for stage 1 because they're in evolution, but it doesn't count for basic Pokemon. And in terms of its playability in the format, we don't really have any fire decks. You could say Charizard, but Charizard is actually a dark Pokemon, it's not a fire Pokemon. I guess it could see play in Celareg just to help boost its damage up a little bit, even though that deck could already hit pretty large amounts of damage. Gouging Fire it doesn't really do anything in. So at the moment, while it is a pretty decent card, we don't really have any evolution fire decks running around in the format. Maybe in future sets it could see play, because that extra 10 damage could actually means something depending on the matchup. And speaking of Celareg, we have Celareg here. This isn't Celareg EX, this is just Celareg. 140 HP stage 1 fire type Pokemon, whose first attack is the reason why this card caught my attention. For a single colorless energy, you discard all special energy from all of your opponent's Pokemon. This card will probably see play inside of the Celareg deck, maybe as a one-of, as it is a very good counter to stuff like Lugia, Terrapagos, maybe the new Hydreigon because they play Neo Upper Energy, just anything that plays special energy, and especially against something like Lugia, once they've gone through a couple of Primal Turbos, you can use this attack, discard all of those energies, and they might not even have any energies left in the deck, especially since Lugia is a deck that, wants to discard Archeops, so some of the times they may have to discard their entire hand with something like Research or Squawkabilly, so they might be discarding a few energies that they've drawn. You've used some Primal Turbos, taken some energy out of the deck, and now there just isn't any left, meaning that you can very easily just clean up the game with a Celareg EX. I imagine this card will probably see play inside of Celareg EX decks as just a one-of, maybe, because it's only useful against a couple of decks in the format. But if we see more special energy decks in the future, it could see a more prominent appearance in that deck, and it may even see play inside of other decks as like a 1-1 line. Keeping on with the fire theme, we have Scovillain EX, 260 HP fire type Pokemon, and its ability says that this Pokemon is treated as a grass and a fire type. I'm not sure how that works, but that's pretty cool, I guess. And then its attack for 2 fire does 10 damage plus 70 more damage for each damage counter on this Pokemon. So with a max of 260 HP, we do 25 times 7. That is a lot. 25 times 70. Is that right? 1,750 damage? I don't know if that's right, but if so, yeah, this card can pretty much one-hit KO anything. If it's doing almost 2,000 damage, that's actually pretty insane. And it's actually pretty easy to get a couple of damage counters on this card. You have stuff like Magma Basin, you have Gapejaw Bog, so when you put your Caps Kids into play, they're going to take a little bit of damage. So then you have a couple of damage counters, and if it gets attacked, that's more damage counters, so you can do even more damage. It is a very, very interesting card, very interesting deck, but is it going to see play? We'll have to wait and see, since you are having to damage your own Pokemon, which could put them in range of your opponent to easily one-hit KO. So there is that kind of risk. Plus we have stuff like Dusknoir, which can just do 130 damage, and now, you know, it's within range of a KO. But at the same time, if they can't get that KO, you're doing 13 times 70, which is, you know, over 700 damage, so you can just KO pretty much anything. It's an interesting card. We'll just have to wait and see if it sees play as its own deck. Next up, Milotic EX, 270 HP water Pokemon with an ability that prevents all damage from and effects of attacks from your opponent's Terra Pokemon done to this Pokemon. And this attack does 160 damage for a water and 2 colorless, and your opponent's active Pokemon is now asleep. So that ability prevents damage from and effects of attacks, which basically means it can't take damage from, you know, like bench hitting attacks or like damage counters. However, it's only from Terra Pokemon, keep in mind. And currently we have stuff like Greninja EX, which can, you know, hit the bench for a certain amount of damage. We have Dragapult, which can put 6 damage counters. And I can't really think of any other Terra EX Pokemon that can hit the bench. But it's a very interesting card. If we see more Terra Pokemon in the future that can, you know, hit the bench, I believe we may have a few coming later on. I'm not entirely certain, but it could see play though. Its attack isn't really the best, 160 damage, but your opponent's active Pokemon is now asleep. Asleep is a pretty good status condition because it stops your opponent's Pokemon from retreating, and you also have to flip a coin to see if it wakes up. So it basically forces them to use more resources into that Pokemon in order to recover it from asleep. But we'll just have to wait and see if this card has a time in the spotlight. Next up is Walrein, 170 HP water type Pokemon, and its first attack is pretty interesting. For 1 water energy, it does 60 damage, but then during your opponent's next turn, Pokemon that have 2 or less energy attached cannot attack. This includes new Pokemon that came into play. And if we take a look at the format, pretty much every deck requires minimum 2 energy in order to attack. There obviously are some decks that require more energy in order to attack. Regidrago requires 3, Lugia requires about like 3 or 4, Terrapagos is 2, Palkia's 2, Dragapult's 2, Raging Bolt is 2 energy, Charizard's 2 energy, you know, just all of those decks. Gardevoir's 3 energy, so all those types of decks, basically, they can't attack unless they have to commit another energy onto that Pokemon, which obviously is going to waste an energy, and then when that Pokemon gets knocked out, it's now going to have those energies into the discard, so you're going to have a little bit of trouble maybe getting them back. But it is a very interesting type of card, although it is a stage 2, so it is going to take a bit to get out, and it is pretty frail, 170 HP, so it can be one-hit KO'd by most things in the format. Although it is not susceptible to Dusknoir, it still is Dusknoir with like 40 HP, but it's still a very interesting card that could see play, maybe a couple of stall decks here and there. We'll just have to wait and see. Speaking of stall, Pikachu EX, 200 HP electric Terra Pokemon with the red, I can't pronounce. The ability says that if this Pokemon has full HP and would be knocked out by damage from an attack, it is not knocked out and its HP becomes 10. Key things to know here about this ability: if this Pokemon has full HP, so if it's already taken damage and then you do enough damage to knock it out, it will not remain on 10 HP and it will be KO'd. Another thing to note, if this Pokemon will be KO'd by damage from an attack. So if you use an insta-kill attack like Giratina V-Star or Roaring Moon, it will bypass the ability. I also believe Survival Brace doesn't work. People have been asking, like, if you attach Survival Brace, does it like do stuff? It's like, the ability is Survival Brace. It doesn't matter. And his attack for 1 grass, 1 lightning and 1 metal does 300 damage, but you have to discard 3 energy from this Pokemon. That kind of doesn't matter because 300 damage is a lot. It can pretty much KO any basic Terra EX, any basic EX. It can KO Stage 1 EX Pokemon. A couple of Stage 2 Pokemon it can one-hit KO. It can't really KO a couple of Stage 2 EX Pokemon like Dragapult, Charizard, that type of thing. But even then, you can just like do a little bit of chip damage or something like that to like get that extra damage in. You could even play the new Stadium that reduces the health of Stage 2 Pokemon by 30, I believe it is. So now you could possibly hit that knockout. And in Japan, this is hyped up to be one of the new meta contenders, so it will probably get its own video later down the line, depending on how well it ends up doing. But it is still a very strong Pokemon that players are very hyped to build. And one card that they are going to be playing alongside it is Magneton, Stage 1, 100 HP electric Pokemon with the Overload Discharge ability. Says during your turn you may attach up to 3 basic energy cards from your discard pile to your electric Pokemon in any way you like, but if you use this ability, this Pokemon is knocked out. The ability to recycle back 3 basic energy onto any of your lightning Pokemon, so it can be played in any lightning deck, it can be played in Miraidon, it can be played in Pikachu, but the fact that it is knocked out can be a little bit of a downside, but it could be a bit of a buff, because it means that you can now use some, counter cards, very much how people are playing Dusknoir. So you could use stuff like Counter Catcher, you could use Briar, so you can manipulate prizes in multiple different ways. So it is a very strong card that will definitely see play in pretty much every lightning deck for the foreseeable future. And now we move on to some of the more annoying Pokemon. Rotom, 80 HP lightning Pokemon, and its attack, Crushing Pulse, says that for 1 lightning energy it doesn't do any damage, but your opponent reveals their hand and you discard all item cards and Pokemon tool cards you find there. Some of you may remember a card called Eri, which allowed you to look at your opponent's hand and discard 2 item cards. Rotom just allows you to discard every item card and tool card from your opponent's hand. So if your opponent is playing an evolution deck, you can just get rid of the rare candies, and item cards are a very difficult type of card to recycle back, meaning that you could pretty much just win the game right there and then by discarding everything your opponent needs in order to get their board established and set up. Very, very annoying card that is probably definitely going to see playing control decks, because they already don't have enough support. Miraidon, 120 HP electric Pokemon with the Code Protect. For 1 lightning and 1 colorless does 40 damage, and then during your opponent's next turn, you prevent all damage done to each of your future Pokemon by attacks from Pokemon EX. But if this Pokemon is no longer in the active, this effect ends. Very, very strong protection wall type of Pokemon that basically prevents your future Pokemon from being hit by EX Pokemon, which, every deck is playing EX Pokemon. That's pretty much the deck's main attacker, except for like a couple like Regidrago, Lugia, Palkia, but most of the time you're going to be attacking with EX Pokemon. And the fact that it says if this Pokemon is no longer in the active, this effect ends, means that your opponent is going to have to play around it. They may have to boss something up, they may have to counter capture something. They basically have to commit resources in order to get this effect to subside. And if they can't get those resources, then they can still attack, but they're not going to do any damage. Nothing to prevent all damage done to your opponent's to your future Pokemon. I'm not sure if that also stops bench hitting attacks and damage counter attacks. People have to let me know, but I believe it does. Probably see play inside a future box if that deck starts seeing play again. Next up is a trio, the Lake Spirits from the Sinnoh region. We'll start with Uxie, which says for 1 Psychic you can put 2 damage counters on each of your opponent's Pokemon. Very similar to Tapu Koko back in the Sun and Moon era, but Tapu Koko required 2 colorless energy and it did 20 damage to each of your opponent's Pokemon, whereas Uxie puts damage counters on them. Completely different. But what do the other 3 do? While this card is very strong, you can put 2 damage counters on everything, so other stuff it could work with, I'm not really sure off the top of my head. But what does Mesprit do? Well, Mesprit says for 1 colorless, you can attach 2 basic psychic energy from your hand to your Pokemon any way you like. Pretty decent, but its second attack for 2 psychic does 160 damage. However, if you don't have Uxie and Azelf on your bench, this attack doesn't do anything. However, the one that everyone is hyping up is Azelf. His attack for 1 psychic and a colorless does 10 damage, but an additional 10 more damage for each damage counter on all of your opponent's Pokemon. So if you pair this with something that, can do a lot of spread damage, something like Dragapult, which can do 200 damage and then 6 damage counters wherever it wants, that's 26 damage counters, so that's an additional 260 damage for a 2 energy attack. You also have stuff like Hydreigon. Its attack does require a psychic, so you could play this inside of that, and you can do 130 damage to 3 Pokemon. That's 39 damage counters, so almost 400 damage. The 3 by themselves, I could see them being played in decks, but Azelf is the one that is probably going to see play inside of decks that can utilize psychic energy. Stuff like, obviously, Hydreigon, Dragapult, maybe even Gardevoir, stuff like that. So it's definitely something that you'll want to pick up and keep an eye on if you plan to play any decks that can use psychic energy in the future. Next up is a Pokemon that could see play alongside Frostlass. None of you know what Frostlass does. It basically puts 2 damage counters on all Pokemon with abilities during Pokemon Checkup. And Cofagrigus, a 120 HP Psychic type Pokemon, for 1 Psychic Energy puts 6 damage counters on each Pokemon that has an ability, both yours and your opponent's. So this, combined with a couple of Frostlasses on the bench, could lead to multiple knockouts and heavy amounts of spread damage. Very, very strong card that could see play inside of like a Frostlass Cofagrigus deck. However, Dusknoir is a card, and at the moment that card is kind of gatekeeping single prize decks, because obviously they have such low HP that you can just Dusknoir and trade with one of them, and especially in a deck that's playing stage 1 Pokemon, you're going to have to take some more time to build that back up. But maybe if we get some form of bench protection or anything like that, in fact, you could play it with Gastrodon. You could play Gastrodon, Cofagrigus, and what's his name? Frostlass. There you go. And you could play some kind of, heavy spread damage deck that's looking to take multiple prizes in a single knockout, maybe even take all your prizes at once. Speaking of taking all your prizes at once, Palossand EX, 280 HP Psychic type Terra Pokemon. Sandtomb, 3 energy, 160 damage, your opponent's Pokemon can't retreat, but the one we're going to be looking at is the second attack. For a water, psychic, and a fighting energy, you put damage counters on all of your opponent's bench Pokemon until the remaining HP is 100. So you basically put damage counters on everything your opponent controls until its HP is 100. Now, how is this, going to help you win the game? Dusknoir. You could just evolve into a Dusknoir, blow something up, evolve into another Dusknoir, blow something up, evolve into another Dusknoir, blow something up. Because Dusknoir does 13 damage counters, 130 damage, you can pretty much put everything your opponent controls in range of Dusknoir. And if it's an EX Pokemon, you just have to blow up 3 Dusknoirs to win the game. It is a very, very strong card that could see play as like a hybrid Dusknoir deck, so you'd play this and Dusknoir, but it obviously is going to take some time to set up because you need 3 different energies, and even then with stuff like Crystal, you're going to need 2 different energies, and they are like pretty weird types of energies like Water, Psychic, and Fighting. I can't really think of any like support stuff. You could play it alongside Xatu, but then you have a very heavy lineup of evolution Pokemon, so it could end up being a bit bricky. Again, we'll have to wait and see, but it is a very, very strong card. Next up is Fluttermane, 90 HP Psychic Ancient Pokemon. For 2 energy, it can move all damage counters from one of your benched Ancient Pokemon to your opponent's active Pokemon. So if you've used something like Frenzied Gouging and now you've got 200 damage on your Roaring Moon EX, you could put this into the active and move that 200 damage to one of your opponent's Pokemon. Well, it has to be the active Pokemon, never mind. But even then, that is a very, very strong attack. The fact that you can not only do a huge amount of damage depending on how much damage your Pokemon has taken, but you're also healing away that damage at the same time, so now you can use Frenzied Gouging again without risk of being knocked out, or trading with your opponent's Pokemon. So it could see play inside of Ancient decks, and given that its attack cost is obviously you know, generic. It could see play inside of not just Ancient Box, but also Roaring Moon, since you can just attach a darkness energy to it. It doesn't have to be a psychic energy. And another ancient card that could see play inside of Ancient Box is Coridon, a 130 HP fighting ancient, which for 2 colorless energy does 30 damage plus an additional 150 more damage if one of your other ancient Pokemon used an attack during your last turn. So you can do 180 damage total for 2 energy if an ancient Pokemon attacked last turn. Much better than the Coridon we got before, which I believe did 30 damage for each benched ancient Pokemon or each ancient Pokemon you had in play. So you basically had to fill up your bench as much as you possibly could with ancient Pokemon. However, this one just does 180 damage if one of your ancients attacked last turn. So you could attack with something like the Baby Roaring Moon, that gets knocked out, you could bring in Coridon, and now you can hit for 180 damage since your ancient Pokemon attacked last turn. So this is probably definitely going to replace Coridon, the previous Coridon, inside of Ancient Box decks. And now we move on to something that I previously mentioned before in the video, Hydreigon EX, 330 HP Dark Terror Pokemon with 2 very strong attacks. For 1 Darkness and 1 Colorless, you do 200 damage, and then you can discard the top 3 cards of your opponent's deck. This can be very good depending on the matchup. However, currently in the format we do have quite a few decks that like stuff being in the discard. Obviously Regidrago, you could end up discarding a dragon Pokemon that they can now use. Celareg, you could discard all energy, so now they're going to do even more damage. Lugia, you could discard Archeops, so now they can get them back. But against other decks you could end up discarding some useful resources. However, its second attack is the one that a lot of people have been mainly building the deck around. For 1 Psychic, Darkness, Metal and Colorless for energy, it does 130 damage, and then it also does 130 damage to 2 of your opponent's benched Pokemon. So you're basically hitting 130 and then 130 to 2 of your opponent's benched Pokemon. You're basically using Dusknoir 3 times, but for a heavy cost of 4 energy. However, this can easily be fixed with stuff like Neo Weapon Energy, Sparkling Crystal, Counter Gain since it does require a colorless energy. So while the attack's cost may seem pretty steep, you can actually fulfill it fairly easily. And very much like Pikachu, people are hyping this up to be another one of the best decks to come from this set. And I am also very tempted to build it, but I'm going to wait a little while to see how it does. And this deck will probably get its own video later on in the line, so I can talk about it and explain more about it when the time comes. Up next, Eternatus, of 150 HP Dragon Pokemon. For 1 Darkness, if your opponent's active Pokemon is an EX, it does 80 more damage, not really the best. World Eater, for a Fire and 2 Darkness, 230 damage, and you can discard a Stadium in play, but if you can't, this attack does nothing. This could see play inside of Regidrago, because we do have quite a few decks in the format that like using Stadium cards. Raging Bolt, Lugia uses Metagoza, Terrapagos. We have Dragapult likes to use a few stall Stadium cards. Palkia, again the same thing with Terrapagos since they're kind of played alongside each other. So not only can you do 230 damage, but you're also getting rid of your opponent's Stadium card. Granted, if they don't have a Stadium card in play, you can't use the attack. So most of the time you're probably just going to use Dragapult again. But maybe you want to use World Ender because 230 damage could help knock out the active instead of just doing 200 and then 6 bench snipe. So it could see play instead of Regidrago as just a one-of. Next up is a card very similar to Durant in the case of that. It's not a good card, but it's an EX, so might as well talk about it. Tatsugiri EX. 160 HP Dragon Terror Pokemon. Surprise Pump. For a fire and a water does 100 damage and it isn't affected by any effects of your opponent's active Pokemon. Not good damage for that amount of energy. And then for a fire, water and dark, you look at the top 10 cards of your deck and put as many Pokemon you find there onto your bench. Keep in mind it just says any number of Pokemon you find there, so if you end up finding evolutions, you can just put them straight onto the bench. Sounds pretty good, but it is a bit of a steep cost for a fire, water and darkness, and by the time you end up using it, your bench is probably already full of other cards. So while it does seem pretty strong, it's not really going to see any play, but it's an EX, so it's kind of worth talking about. Next up, Slacking. I say slacking. Slacking EX. 340 HP, colourless, and it's born to slack. If your opponent has no EX or V Pokemon in play, it can't attack. And then for 2 colourless energy, it does 280 damage, and you discard an energy from this Pokemon. 280 damage is pretty good, but the fact that you have to discard an energy, and if your opponent doesn't have an EX or V in play, it can't do anything, the card probably isn't going to see play. It's also a stage 2, so obviously you need to spend time setting it up. Its attack cost is pretty easy to fulfill, something like double turbo energy and neo upper energy and all that kind of thing, but then you have to discard it and it only does 280. It's probably not going to see play. But one card that is probably going to see play is a new Terrapagos, 120 HP colourless. Prism Charge allows you to attach 3 basic energy cards of different types from your deck to your Terra Pokemon in any way you like for a single colourless energy. Very strong way to accelerate energy into play if you're playing a deck that requires multiple different types of basic energy, which is pretty much every, new Stellar Pokemon, or just other Terra Pokemon, for example Dragapult and like any Dragon type Terra Pokemon. So yeah, it'll probably see play inside of Terra-based decks as a way to just help accelerate out lots of energy. And now for the trainers and supporters. Cyrano, search your deck for up to 3 Pokemon EX, reveal them and put them into your hand. It's decent, but we have other stuff that we're going to talk about later on. Deduction Kit, look at the top 3 cards of your deck, put them back in any order, or shuffle them and put them on the bottom of the deck. Just lets you look at like the couple cards from the top of your deck. If you find something that you may need, you can obviously put them back in any order, but if you find something that you don't need, you can put them on the bottom of the deck and then maybe draw into something that you do need. Just helps manipulate the top of your deck. Terra Orb, search your deck for a Terra Pokemon, reveal it and put it to your hand. Immediately better than Cyrano because it's an item card, so you can use multiple and you don't waste your support for the turn. And that's it. That is what I think are the best cards coming out of this set. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, what you think about this set. Overall, I think it's a bit mixed. There are some pretty good cards, there are some mid cards, and there's also some bad cards. I'd give it like 5. It's alright, I guess. But in terms of like powerhouse, like game-breaking cards, doesn't really have that. It is the final set of the year, and it's also like the final set before the next rotation, so I imagine they probably would have put some good stuff in here, but obviously they haven't. They're probably going to save it until next year when we actually get the new rotation. But yeah, let me know your thoughts in the comments, what you think about this set, what you think about some of the cards. If there's any cards I didn't mention that you think are good, also let me know. Remember to like, comment and subscribe, and I shall see you in the next video, whatever that may be. Take care.